Hello and welcome to my video all about how to add lifelines to your knitting. Lifelines are an easy method of fixing any knitting mistake. And the lifelines I'm going to show you today are proactive lifelines as opposed to reactive lifelines. What that means is the lifelines need to be put in before you make the mistake, so you've got to anticipate the making of a mistake. Whereas a reactive lifeline is a lot trickier to use and is added in after you've made a mistake. The reason I like proactive lifelines best is that they're so much easier to add to your work. To add lifelines, you're going to need a needle which has an eye big enough for yarn to go through. I prefer using a tapestry needle rather than a yarn needle, just because it's smaller and therefore easier to push through the knitted stitches. You'll also need a scrap piece of yarn, preferably slightly thinner than the yarn you're knitting with. If you don't have any yarn a size smaller, then just use the same size of yarn instead. You'll also need a needle threader or a scrap piece of thread. Okay, so here I have some knitting I've already done. I'm simply doing slip stitch edges on a garter stitch scarf. It's unlikely you'll be adding lifelines in this kind of situation, unless you're a beginner and anticipate making mistakes and wouldn't know how to fix them. Usually, if you're a more advanced knitter, you'll only add lifelines when you're doing something tricky, for instance, two-colour brioche or lace knitting. Adding these proactive lifelines every couple of inches or so means that you never have to re-knit more than a couple of inches of your knitting, even when you make a mistake. So at this point in the knitting, I've just finished doing an even numbered row. It's always best to be consistent when adding lifelines. For instance, I always try to add lifelines after I've just finished an even numbered row. That way, when I go back to a lifeline, I know that the next row I'm going to knit is an odd numbered row. You can do a lifeline after an odd numbered row if you prefer, but just be consistent throughout. The piece of scrap yarn you're going to be using should be at least 2 times the width of your knitting. I'm using some orange yarn here, and I'm just going to thread it into the needle. Because it's fiddly and difficult to get this yarn through the eye of the needle, I'm going to use a scrap piece of thread to help me. I'm just going to fold the piece of thread in half and then feed the fold through the eye of the needle. I then put the end of the yarn into the loop that's just gone through the needle, and then I pull on the ends of the thread to force that yarn through the eye of that needle. You might need a bit of brute force to do this. Slide the needle towards one end of the yarn, and then you're going to feed that needle through all the stitches on the knitting needle. So I'm just going to start at the top stitch, and I'm going to feed my tapestry needle through all the stitches right down to the end. And I'll do this by sliding the tapestry needle against the knitting needle. Every so often I pull on the tapestry needle to pull through the yarn, like so, making sure there's a few inches of yarn tail on the right, because the last thing you want to do is pull the yarn out of the stitches. Once I'd finished feeding that yarn through the stitches, I tied a loose knot at this end, next to the last stitch. So when I come to put the knitting needle back into my knitted stitches, I'm going to push the needle into the stitches from the knot side first. When you come to knitting the next row, just make sure that you don't accidentally pick up the scrap yarn and tangle it up in your knitting. I'm just going to do a couple of rows now, and then I'm going to demonstrate what you do if you make a mistake. Okay, so I've done a couple of rows of knitting, and let's pretend I made a mistake on this row. All you would do is take the knitting needle out of the stitches, which can be a bit scary, but don't worry about it, the lifeline will save you. And you just pull on the working yarn to unravel the knitting. It's impossible to unravel your knitting too far because the lifeline will stop you, as demonstrated here. So once you've unravelled down to that lifeline, what you're going to do is feed your knitting needle back into the stitches, and as I mentioned before, you're going to feed it from the side that has the knot on it. So you simply feed the knitting needle from the knot side of the scrap yarn, and you follow that scrap yarn all the way through the stitches. So as long as that scrap yarn stays in contact with your knitting needle, then you're on the right track. And it's as simple as that. You just follow the path of the orange yarn all the way through. And once you've finished, you can then just carry on knitting again. Because I always put lifelines in after I've done an even numbered row, I always know that at this point I go on to an odd numbered row. And I don't even have to think about it. And that's why consistency is important. How many times you put a lifeline into your work is completely up to you. If you're doing something particularly complicated, then you might want to put a piece of yarn in every inch or two. But if you're doing something quite simple, you might want to do it every 4 or 5 inches instead. It's completely up to you. After all, it only takes a very short amount of time to do, and you only need to use a very short amount of yarn. You can, of course, use the same piece of yarn over and over again throughout your knitting. With regards to reactive lifelines, where you put the lifelines in after you've made a mistake, as I said before, it's quite a tricky thing to do because you have to have a lot of knowledge, and the method of adding that type of lifeline changes depending on what type of stitch you are making. So it does get tricky. There are really good YouTube tutorials about it if you're interested in doing that instead, but I personally would definitely recommend trying to anticipate a mistake rather than trying to fix it after it's already happened. I really hope this video has been helpful to you, and thank you very much for watching.